Hello, my name is Anil Shrestha and I'm a professor in the Plant Science Department at California State University, Fresno. In this video, we are going to discuss why weed identification is important, and I will provide you some examples of some common weed species in California vegetable production systems. So let's begin. So we will talk about in this video why weed species identification is important. We'll also talk about the differences between native, invasive, and agricultural weeds. Then we will talk about some of the methods of weed species identification, and then I'll show you some pictures of some common weeds that we find in vegetable cropping systems in California. So why is weed species identification important? Now, there are many weeds that are non-native plants that have been introduced to North America from Europe and Asia. Some weeds cause more problem than others, and some cause crop losses. Some weeds are poisonous, some cause allergies, some weeds are breeding grounds for insect pests, some even cause ecosystem damages, whilst there are some positive benefits to weeds, such as weeds can indicate soil health, some weeds are edible, and there are many weeds that have medicinal properties. So the first step in understanding any problem is to correctly identify it. So correct identification of weeds is a key for designing effective control strategies for these weed populations. So again, why is weed identification important? We now know that no single herbicide or control technique will get rid of all the weeds. And even if we use herbicides, with the same mode of action repeatedly, they will select for weed populations that will become resistant to that particular herbicide. And even if we use other methods of weed control, such as mechanical weed control methods, they also can adapt to those systems. Therefore, we need to use multiple strategies or a combination of different techniques to control weeds, and we call it integrated weed management. So, continuing on why weed species identification is important, even when you are using herbicides, you have to know what the weed species that you're dealing with is, because to kill that weed or control that weed, we have to use the right herbicide. And very often, a common reason why herbicides fail to control a certain weed is because the materials that you are using may not be for that specific weed. In other words, it may not be suitable for controlling that particular weed. So the other thing is, all weeds do not cause equal damage to crops. Some weeds are more competitive than other species, and maybe it's important, or it is important, to get those weeds controlled than certain weed species. And then, although weeds may not be competing directly with your crops, some weed species can actually serve as hosts for insect pests or pathogens that can move from the weed to the vegetable crop and cause damages. For example, here's a picture from the University of Arizona where you can see green peach aphids on cheeseweed, and this picture was taken adjacent to a lettuce field where the aphids moved on to the lettuce field and caused damage to the crop as well. Now, some weeds can interfere with harvest operations as well. As you can see in this field, you can barely recognize it's a tomato field. So harvesting in such a field can be problematic. Again, even within the same weed species, we now have cases of herbicide resistant and susceptible biotypes. The same weed species can have those two different biotypes, and it's important to recognize that as well. The other thing is different weed species have different modes of reproduction. Many annuals or most annuals reproduce by seeds, whereas perennial weeds can reproduce from seeds as well as vegetative organs. Therefore, the management strategies can be different or should be different for annuals and perennials. So, before I begin talking about weeds, we should recognize the fact that we have native plants and non-native plants that are here in our state. Some species are what we call native plants, and those are the species that are indigenous to this region, and oftentimes they evolved before the arrival of human settlers in this area, and they comprise the ecosystem. For example, fiddleneck, which we see commonly in California during the winter months, is a native plant. But can native plants behave as weeds? You can see fiddleneck that has taken over a vegetable field in California. So then we have the invasive weeds. These are actually non-natives, and they are unwanted plants that have come to this place from another part of the world or even from another state, and they are most likely to cause harm compared to the native plants. They can either originate from other countries or from the same country but from different regions. We have approximately 183 invasive weed species in California, generally in non-crop areas. For example, yellow star thistle, which is very much a part of our landscape, is an invasive weed, and it is actually the #1 invasive weed in California. Although I mentioned that invasive species are usually in natural ecosystems, this particular weed has also been observed in agricultural cropping systems. Then we have the agricultural weeds that we are concerned about. Many of these agricultural weeds are non-native plant species, but they have established themselves in our crop production systems, whereas invasive species are mostly found in non-crop areas. Now, let's get to the basics of weed identification. What are some of the important things to know about weed identification? The first thing to know is, are they monocots or dicots? Monocots are grasses. They have only one cotyledonary leaf, and later they will develop features called ligules and auricles that can help in identification. The leaf sheaths are split and wrapped around the stem, and the leaves have parallel veins. Now, there is another type of plant or a group of plants that look like grasses. These are what we call sedges. They are not grasses. They look like grasses but have no ligules or auricles. The leaf sheath is continuous around the stem, and one particular feature that is important in letting us know whether they are a grass or a sedge is the stem, which is triangular in cross section. And then we have the broadleaves or the dicots as we know them as. These have two cotyledonary leaves and netted veins. So here's an example of a monocot or a grass and a sedge. They look very similar, but if you were to look at the stem closely, the grasses will not have the triangular stem. They will either be flat or round or other shape other than triangular, whereas the nut sedge on the right will have triangular stems as they develop. Here's another example of dicots. On the left you see black nightshade, and on the right you see annual morning glory. The annual morning glory that you see on the screen is at a cotyledonary stage. So the two leaves you see here are not true leaves. They are cotyledonary leaves. As on the left picture you can see that cotyledonary leaves of the black nightshade at the bottom. The top leaves that you see are now the true leaves. So the next thing is understanding the mechanisms of reproductions. So the first picture you see on the top is that of seeds. Most of the annual plants reproduce by seeds. It's not that perennials don't reproduce by seeds. They can reproduce by seeds as well as specialized organs such as rhizomes, tubers, and roots. Here is an example of two common annuals. Pigweed, which we see commonly in our systems, in agricultural systems, are summer annuals. You would see them in the summer. Whereas common groundsel is a winter annual, and you usually see them flowering during the winter and spring months. Then we have the biennials. The biennials complete their life cycle in 2 years. They grow as a rosette they remain as a rosette actually in the first year, and then they regrow and complete their life cycle in the second year. Some common examples in California of such weeds are common burdock and wild carrot. Perennials, on the other hand, take more than 2 years to complete their life cycle. There are 3 types of perennials: the simple herbaceous type, which would be something like dandelion. Then we have Johnson grass, which has been classified as a creeping herbaceous, and something like poison oak, which is a woody plant. All of these are perennials, and they have different modes of reproduction other than the seed. Let's look at some of the weed identification basics that we can use for the identification purposes, and we will go through some of the structures and shapes that will help us identify the weed. First is the growth habit. Many weeds grow prostrate, whereas some weeds grow upright. So even by looking at the growth habit can lead you towards proper identification of these plants. The root system can also help us identify the plant. Most of the grasses have a fibrous root system, as you can see on the left, whereas the dicots or the broadleaf plants have a taproot system, as you can see on the right side of your screen. The next feature can be the stems. Stems can be of different shapes, such as round or square, and these are again good features for identifying the species. Then we have the perennial plants that have specialized stems. For example, you can see on the top left of your screen Johnson grass that has specialized below ground structures called rhizomes through which they can reproduce. On the top right side you can see Bermuda grass with stolons that are surface stem structures that can help with reproduction. On the bottom left side you have tubers of yellow nut sedge plants. Each of those tubers can give rise to a new plant, whereas on the bottom right hand of your screen you can see a bulb like structure which helps in reproduction as well. So these are all specialized structures of the plant that help them in reproduction other than the seed. Then the other feature that helps us identify weeds is the leaf arrangements. Plants have opposite leaves, they can have whorled leaves, alternate leaves, or the basal rosette type leaves. So far we have been talking about the reproduction modes of reproduction of plant species or weed species in this case, and we've also been talking about what are some of the features that can help us identify a weed species or different kinds of weeds species, and we will go on further to talk about more features that can help us identify weeds. The leaf edges again can help us identify the weeds. For example, here you can see some types of leaf edges: smooth, rounded teeth, lobed, pointed teeth, or feathered. Even the shapes and sizes of the leaves and the veins can help us identify the plant. We can have deeply cut leaves, heart shaped leaves, football shaped leaves, round leaves, arrow shaped leaves, or even kidney shaped leaves. So these are some of the leaf shapes, and that's not all of them. This is just an example of a few. Another feature that can be used for weed identification is the arrangement of the leaves on the plant. Some plants have simple leaves, as you can see here. They can be of different shape, but they are individual leaves on a stalk or a petiole, and others can be of different kinds. For example, compound leaves, where you see multiple leaves on a petiole or a stalk, and instead of being an individual leaf, it is a group of leaflets that make the whole leaf. So such leaf features can also help us identify what weed it may be. The leaf stalks can also help us identify the species. Some plants have stalks, as you can see on the left picture. Some do not have those stalks. They actually clasp the leaves. By they I mean the leaves can actually clasp the stem without having a stalk. Now we are going to change the topic and talk about what are the families of weeds that are considered the world's worst weeds. And you can see on the list that the grasses or the Poaceae family comprise of 44 species, and they are considered the world's worst weeds. They make up 22% of the world's worst weeds, followed by the Asteraceae plants, which would be your sunflower type of plants, followed by the Cyperaceae, which are your sedges, and so on and so forth. So this is a list of the world's worst weeds. In the year 2017, the Weed Science Society of America compiled a list of the top 10 weeds in broadleaf crops, fruits, and vegetables in the United States. On the left, you see the most troublesome ones, and on the right, you see the most common ones. If you pay attention on the most troublesome ones, other than Kochia, we have almost all the other species. Water hemp, not as much in the cropping systems. We see them mostly in roadsides, but in recent years, there have been sightings of water hemp even in some of the annual crops. On the right side, the most common ones, we have all 10 species, again, water hemp being less common than the others. So far I've talked about identification. Now I will show you some pictures and even videos of some of the common broadleaf agricultural weeds of vegetables in California, and then later on I'll show you some grasses. So here you see common lamb squatters and nettle leaf goosefoot. They both belong to the Chenopodium species. They look very alike when they are seedlings or even at an adult stage. You can confuse the two, but I will tell you or show you a video on how to identify the two species. So here is a video of common lamb squatters. Notice the reddish tinge on it at the edges, and you will see that reddish tinge also on the underside, and usually you see the silver like dusting on the leaves. That is more common in common lamb squatters, and the silver dust is also evident on the underside of the leaf. Again, it has a reddish tinge to it that I just mentioned. In this video you are going to see nettle leaf goosefoot. You see, it does not usually have the reddish tinge to it. It does not have the prominent silver like dusting on it. It's more thicker in texture than common lamb squatters. It does have some silver dusting on the backside, but you don't see the reddish tinge as you would see in the common lamb squatters. and although you cannot touch it here, the other feature is the nettle leaf goosefoot feels more leathery in touch than the common lamb squatters. Two other species that people confuse quite a bit. One is your annual morning glory and the other is field bindweed. Now, annual morning glory is an annual plant and it completes its life cycle in a year, whereas field bindweed is a perennial plant and it takes more than a year to complete its life cycle. Field bindweed also has a very vigorous root system that makes it very difficult to control. You can also see the differences in the flower shapes and colors in this slide. Here you can see field bindweed. Look at the shape of the leaf. It is very different from what you saw in the previous slide of morning glory. It's more like a lance shaped leaf and it's more prominent when it's at the seedling stage. So this is field bindweed, and people often confuse it with annual morning glory, but it's not annual morning glory. It's a more difficult weed to control. I will zoom in and you can see the leaf shape more clearly here.
Now here are two common species. These are winter annuals, but people often confuse the two species. Both of them are sow thistles, but the one on your left is called annual sow thistle, whereas the one on the right is called spiny sow thistle. And you can see from the leaves how spiny sow thistle gets its name. And as I said, both of these are winter annuals. Let me show you a video of what annual sow thistle looks like in the field. Now here's a video of annual sow thistle, and if you pay attention to the leaves, it does not have the petiole or a stalk. The leaf clasps onto the stem and does not have a stalk. Now, I'll also show you the flowers as you can see on the top, but these flowers can be similar in the other sow thistle as well and in many other Asteraceae species.
Here's a video of spiny sow thistle, which is much more spinier in the leaf structure than annual sow thistle, but the flowers look very similar to annual sow thistle. So in the beginning, in the seedling stage, you can confuse the two species. Here are two other species that are very common in vegetable production systems in California, the lesser and the greater swinegrass. On your left is the lesser swinegrass and on the right is your greater swinegrass. They look very identical and have almost the same similar features. You have to look very carefully at the leaf shapes to tell the two apart. But one very good distinguishing feature is the lesser swinegrass. If you were to crush the leaves and the stems in your fingers, it will have a very pungent odor or smell to it, whereas the greater swinegrass will not. Let's look at a video showing the lesser swinegrass. So here's lesser swinegrass. Obviously you cannot smell it, but you can have a look at it, and you've probably seen this plant in vegetable cropping systems, or you will even find this plant in non-crop areas. On the other hand, here's greater swinegrass, and you can see here that they sometimes or oftentimes they occur together in the same place. So one prominent feature that I have used to distinguish the two apart is the smell that I mentioned earlier. So let's move from the swinegrass to some other plants, the two plants that we confuse quite a fair bit, and these are your burr clover and the creeping wood sorrel. Burr clover is on the left and wood sorrel is on your right. The most prominent feature that tells the two apart are the leaves. As you can see, Burr clover on the left does not have the heart shape as the creeping wood sorrel on the right. Here is a video of California burr clover, and please pay attention to the leaf structures. They are what we call trifoliate leaves. We see in this video the wood sorrel, which has heart-shaped leaves but are also trifoliate, and you can tell the two apart. There are different kinds of wood sorrels. I'm not going to mention all of them, but here is the common one that we see in our vegetable fields, and that is your creeping wood sorrel. Let's move on to two other species that are winter annuals, and people get confused between the two as well. We have the henbit on the left and the red maize on the right. We'll see at the flowering stage you can tell the two apart because of the differences in the flowers, but the leaf shapes are completely different. The red maize are more prostrate, whereas the henbit are more erect looking plants. For example, here's a video of henbit. It sort of probably reminds you of crop or mint in this case, and you can see it in this particular picture. As opposed to red maize, which has more elongated leaves, it is more prostrate in growth habit. But I've seen people confuse the two quite often. So this is red maize. Then we have two other species that people always confuse with the horseweed and hairy fleabane. We confuse them especially at the seedling stage. One or two features that I'm going to mention here are the leaf shapes. If you see horseweed on your left, it has more of a club-shaped leaf with less serrations, whereas fleabane on your right has elongated leaves and a lot of serrations. It is also pale green in color compared to horseweed. Once it bolts, you can tell the two apart because horseweed will grow as a single stem, whereas fleabane will have branches. Here is a video of a horseweed seedling, and you can see the club-shaped leaf with very little serrations, as opposed to fleabane, which is more serrated, has more elongated leaves, and you can see that it's also less green in color than the horseweed. Horseweed, by the way, is also referred to as meristale in some parts of the state. Let's look at two more species which people confuse quite often: burning and stinging nettle. Let me tell you the difference between the two. The burning nettle is an annual plant. It's darker green in color. The leaves are not as elongated as stinging nettle, which is, by the way, a perennial plant. It is lesser green in color, a pale in color than the burning nettle, and it also seems to grow taller than the burning nettle. Here is an example of burning nettle in the field, and you can see the leaf shape is more round in shape compared to the stinging nettle. Here are a group of plants called the pigweeds. There are many pigweeds that are problematic in agriculture. The main ones here are redwood pigweed, water hemp, palmer amaranth, spiny amaranth, and Powell amaranth. Other than water hemp, the four that you see on this slide are quite common in California cropping systems. We do have water hemp now emerging as a new problem, relatively new problem in agricultural systems as well. Otherwise, it was more of a roadside weed problem. So here's a picture showing redwood pigweed on the left and prostrate pigweed on the right. You can see or tell the difference between the two by the leaf shape, and later on redwood pigweed will grow erect, whereas prostrate pigweed will, as the name goes, will be more prostrate in growth habit. Another common weed in vegetable cropping systems is common purslane. This is actually an edible plant, and some cultures eat this plant as a vegetable, but here it is a weed. And the most distinguishing feature of this weed is its succulent leaves. The leaves are very succulent. The other species that we confuse quite a fair bit are the nightshades, the black nightshade, the silver leaf nightshade, and the hairy nightshade. The black and the hairy nightshade are annual plants, whereas the silver leaf nightshade can be perennial plants. The leaf shapes can tell the difference. You can use the leaf shape as an identifying feature to tell the difference between the three. The seedlings, you can see the seedling of black nightshade, hairy nightshade, and silver nightshade, and you can see the distinct features or distinguishing features that you can use, that is the leaf shape. So what you've seen or have noticed as a trend as I have been speaking and showing you these videos or slides is I am talking about weeds that look very similar to each other, and as a student of weed science you have to tell the difference, or you have to be able to tell the difference between these species. So I am deliberately using species that look very similar to each other. So here's a video of black nightshade, and look at the leaves. It's more rounded in shape than the silver leaf nightshade, and you don't see as much hairs as you would see in hairy nightshade. Two other species that we get confused often, the mayweed and pineapple weed plants. The most distinguishing feature between the two is the mayweed will have, we also call them chamomile by the way, will have those white petals. The pineapple weed will not. The other feature is the smell. If you would take the pineapple weed head and smell it, it has a sweetish smell. That's how it gets its name, pineapple weed. People say it smells somewhat like pineapples. And another plant or weed species that we often see, especially in tomato and chili pepper fields, is ground cherry. Here you can see in the picture the fruit and the leaves and the flower of ground cherry. So those features should be very helpful in identifying this particular species. And here's another common weed that you see in vegetable cropping systems, and this is called common groundsel. One point I would like to make about this particular plant is this was the first weed to have reported as resistant to an herbicide called atrazine in California. Way back in 1987, this was the first case of an herbicide resistant weed in the state. Here's a video showing the flowers of common groundsel. So you can also use flowers as an identifying feature, but let me tell you, annual sow thistle has similar looking flowers, so this is not always the best identifying feature. Then another common weed, actually people eat this weed as well as a salad, and this is common chickweed. And here's common chickweed in the field. It's a winter annual, and you often see it in prostrate habits, but in recent years I've also seen it climbing up the canopy of the crops. Here's another plant that is very common in our cropping systems, and that is shepherd's purse. This is a seedling. You should be able to tell the plant at the seedling stage, and this is what the plant looks like at the seedling stage. Let me play the video of this shepherd's purse plant, and you can see the leaves. But let me tell you that you can confuse this plant with many other mustard plants that I will show later. The most identifying feature are the heart-shaped seed pods. These are actually seed pods and not the leaves. They have seeds in them, and this is what you can use as an identifying feature of shepherd's purse. Let's look at a London rocket plant. This is one of the mustards, and you can see the characteristic shape of the leaf, and probably that's how it gets its name, London rocket. And at the flowering stage, again, if you look closely, it can look similar to any other mustard plant, but the most identifying feature is the leaf shape. Here's wild mustard, and wild mustard is not as serrated in the leaves as the previous two, shepherd's purse and London rocket. And the leaves are, as I said, less serrated, broader, and also the flowers are like yellow, mostly generally yellow. You'll see another plant in a moment which looks similar but has slightly different colored flowers, and I'm referring to wild radish, which looks very similar to wild mustard. Let me zoom in to the plant and show you the flowers. The flowers are either white or has a more bluish tinge to it, and other than that, if you can look closely, the leaves look very similar to wild mustard, so it's very easy to confuse wild mustard and wild radish. Here's another plant that is very common in our vegetable cropping systems, and that is common mallow, often referred to as cheeseweed. It's one of the easier plants to recognize by its characteristic leaf shape. You can see the round leaf and the leaf structure, so it's more easy to recognize this weed, comparatively easy to recognize this weed in comparison to what we've been seeing so far. Then there are some other plants that are very common. Prickly lettuce. One thing I'd like to point out is that people confuse prickly lettuce with annual sow thistle oftentimes, and it's probably similar looking at the seedling stage. The most distinguishing feature of prickly lettuce is, if you were to look at the underside of the leaf vein, the mid vein, it will have spines. That's probably why it gets the name prickly lettuce. Annual sow thistle will not have those spines. Then another common weed, puncture vine, often referred to as goat heads, is also a common troublesome weed in our summer crops. So far we have been talking about broadleaves. Now let me go through some grasses that we find quite often in our cropping systems here in California. I have a few grasses to show you in the next few slides. One of the features that we can use Before I talk about the features, let me tell you that the grasses are very difficult to identify from each other. Some of the features that we can use to tell them apart are, for example, the sheath. The sheath is the lower portion of the leaf plate that encircles the stem, and the structures of these sheaths or shapes can be different in help us in identifying them. The sheath can be split, overlap, or fused, as you can see in these pictures. Then one of the prominent features that help us identify grasses is the ligule. Now, what is a ligule? It is a structure that grows from the collar area on the inner side of the leaf, and they are of different shapes and sizes and texture. And let me tell you that not all grasses have ligules, but those that do have, here's a plant that is annual bluegrass in this case, and you can see a very prominent ligule. So ligules, as I said, can come in various shapes and sizes, or it can be completely absent. As you can see, some are membranous, fringe of hairs, truncated, rounded, tapered, scalloped, or, as I mentioned, completely absent. The other feature that helps us identify grasses are the auricles. Now, these are appendage looking structures that grows from the edge of the collar and wraps around the stem. Here is a prominent auricle, and let me also tell you that not all plants or grasses in this case have auricles. If they do, just like the ligule, they can be of different shapes and sizes. Now, as I mentioned, the auricles can, just like the ligules, the auricles can also be of different shapes and sizes, as you can see in these pictures: claw-like, rounded, not developed, or absent. Here are two examples of grasses that look very identical to each other: barnyard grass and jungle rice. Both have no auricles, no ligules, the stems are flat. The most distinguishing feature, if you pay close attention, is the stripes. Those black stripes are present on jungle rice, but barnyard grass will not have those stripes. Two other species that can be confused: the green foxtail and the yellow foxtail. In the case of green foxtail, the ligule is hairy, there is no auricle, and the stems have no hairs, as opposed to yellow foxtail on the right, which you see also has a hairy ligule, no auricle, but the leaf collar has very long hairs compared to the green foxtail. So this should be a helpful feature in telling the two apart. Then we have the crabgrasses, which are very common summer grasses in our vegetable cropping systems: the smooth crabgrass and the large crabgrass. Both of them have papery ligules but no auricles, and the hairy crabgrass, by the name itself, has a long hairs or a tuft of hairs at the collar region, compared to the smooth crabgrass, which does not have as long hairs, but it does have stiff white hairs which are shorter in length than the hairy crabgrass. Then wild oats, which is more of a winter grass, and it has a very prominent ligule. As you can see, it's like a saw tooth there, and the auricle is absent. When it gets to the seeding flowering stage, it is very similar to your crop oats, and it is the wild oats. Now, here is another grass. It's more of a winter annual grass. It's called hair barley, or also commonly referred to as common foxtail. You can see the seed head that looks like barley or crop barley, but look at the auricle and the ligule. It is very prominent, and you can see the long auricle, claw-shaped auricle, and also the ligule that helps us identify the species as hair barley. Then a very common grass that's present as a winter grass in our vegetable cropping systems is your annual bluegrass. It is very easy to tell annual bluegrass apart from many other grasses because of its ligule. It has a long pointed type of ligule, as you can see in this picture, no auricle, but another good identifying feature is the boat shaped tip of the leaf. So these are some features that are helpful in telling or distinguishing annual bluegrass from other grasses. So here's a video of annual bluegrass, and please pay attention to the leaves. See, these are, as I zoom in, these are more boat shaped tips that they have, whereas the other grasses don't seem to have this type of feature. Moving on, here's ripcord brome, and let me show you the seed head of this plant. It is, as you can see, it's a plant that has those long looking structures. Those are your seed heads, and I just showed you in that video. Here's another brome grass, and it gets its name soft brome because it feels very soft in texture if you were to touch it or feel the seed head. So this is soft brome. Next is the foxtail brome, and you can see the seed heads are more reddish in color than the other bromes that we just saw. But by the way, I should mention that ripcord brome can also have a reddish tinge to it, but the length of the seed heads are longer than what you just saw here as foxtail brome. Another grass that we see commonly in cropping systems is Bermuda grass, and this is the perennial grass. It seems to go, it is dormant during the winter, but it has stolons that we talked about early on in the videos, and that helps in its reproduction. Now let's switch gears from grasses to sedges, and I'm going to talk about two different sedges that are quite common in our vegetable cropping systems. One is your yellow nut sedge that you can see on the slide here. The picture here is that of yellow nut sedge. Purple nut sedge also is common. The name purple nut sedge comes from the flowers or the seed heads that you see. In this case it's yellow, but in purple nut sedge it would be purple. But there are other features that we can use to tell the two apart. So here's a video of yellow nut sedge. At the seedling stage it may be difficult to tell the two apart, but I will mention some features that you can use to tell yellow nut sedge from purple nut sedge apart. So let me talk about those features that can help you tell the two apart. Yellow nut sedge tubers are small, globe shaped, light brown in color, and if you were to taste them, they have a taste that is similar to almond or an earthy flavor, and each of those tubers are formed at the end of the rhizomes, and it produces 1 to 2 plants from the apical end. Now let me also tell you that these plants can have anywhere from 50 to 200 or 300 tubers per plant, and these tubers are independent or not connected to each other, as you would see in purple nut sedge. In purple nut sedge, they are like in chains. So one tuber is connected to the other in the form of a chain along the rhizome. These are large, oblong, and scaly. They don't have a good taste as the yellow nut sedge tubers. They have a bitter flavor, and I would also like to mention that yellow nut sedge tubers have been used in some cuisines. Some people use the flower of yellow nut sedge to make several cuisines. So this concludes our video on weed identification. I hope you were able to get some distinguishing features that will help you identify similar looking weeds. As you noticed that my trend was to show you weeds that looked similar to each other, and I also hope that you will use this in your life, in your careers, and the slides will help you identify some weeds and management. You can develop some management strategies based on the identification of the different weeds. Thank you.